Right now, I'm feeling a little intimidated and insecure, and I feel very aware specifically of the camera, and I don't know why.
I am feeling excited in the way that I always do when I get to talk to somebody whose mind is really exciting. But also, I thought of this as I was reading Lily's essay, where we find out that she becomes everyone's daughter in group. That for me, being in Lily's presence activates this like, oh, hey, maybe 10 years ago, you could have been like had your head not up your ass and like drifting around, just like being like, I'm going to read Lacan for, and I could have had more of a sense of like purpose and aim. And maybe I should go back and like emotionally spank my previous self and tell her to get her shit together.
I feel like both extremely moved and somewhat ashamed by what you just said, Abby, where I'm like, feeling like I'm now in a position where like I must I'm like, do I have my shit together? What if I can't actually like stand up to that impression of me? And then I'm also feeling this other thing where I'm like, yeah, like obviously, like what if in the next hour and a half I prove my mind to not be like sparkly or deserving of like, however many millions of people may listen to this episode and become patrons of Ordinary Unhappiness, I should hope in the future, will be hearing this and be like, this girl does not deserve to be on a podcast. But then I'm also feeling this even weirder thing, which is like, oh no, I have billed myself as this group relations expert. And so here in the here and now, I should be very good at naming exactly what I'm experiencing in this moment. But the thing that I'm actually experiencing, which is extremely banal, is like my voice echoing in the room. So yeah.
Is this what it's like? The Tavistock thing? I said earlier before we actually started recording that from reading your essay, it both seems like a horrifying experience, like very, very self-revealing and very torturous, but also by the end of it, I kind of want to go. I kind of want to try this.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, you are not the first person to say that to me. I feel like people come up to me about the essay and are like, oh my God, it sounds wild. Like, it's so like crazy that you went to this wacky cult. And also, I want to go. Can I go? How do I go? Like, do they have scholarships? And like the sneak preview answer is like, yes, they actually, most of the conferences in the US do have really strong scholarship funds, and like people should be making use of those. Like, I want more of the kind of person who listens to this pod to be at those conferences. And I do like sort of shamefully and with great self-consciousness stand people going to these things. Like I think they have like a big line about not being therapy. And I think like I am someone who is constantly writing about like, our fantasies of self-transformation and the things that we hope are going to be silver bullets and are going to like radically overhaul our lives very suddenly, and like all of the different historical and political dynamics that those fantasies hold and how unrealistic that is. But like weirdly, Tavistock and group relations like are the closest thing I have found to experiencing them personally, which maybe tellingly is because they make you kind of lose your sense of being like a monad moving through the world as like a totally self-enclosed individual.
You're listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin.
And I'm Dan Yowell.
And today I am so excited to welcome back to the show Lily Scherlis. Lily is a writer and performance artist whose essays have appeared in N+1, Parapraxis, Harper's, and The Drift. She's a member of Groups Group, a working group on group dynamics in social movements, and a PhD candidate in English and theater and performance studies at the University of Chicago. Lily, also just published a wonderful essay in N+1 called Experiences in Groups, in homage to Wilfred Bion's famous book of the same title about her experience in groups at group relations conferences. Lily, welcome to the show. We're so happy to have you back.
Thank you so much. It's an absolute delight to be here.
So our listeners will remember you from the previous episode we did with you about boundaries and attachment and your extreme skepticism towards both of those concepts. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to write your new essay, Experiences in Groups, and how it relates to your previous writing and your other research interests?
Yeah. So broadly speaking, I write about pop psychology. So like our folk theories of the psyche. And I try and think about how these concepts, so yeah, I was talking about boundaries and attachment last time I was on the show. So how concepts like this are related to history, political economy, what have you, to kind of try and trace some of the other intellectual threads that contribute to this kind of common sense vocabulary that we find, on TikTok, all over the internet, and self-help, just popping up in our mind unbidden whenever we try and describe ourselves or our relationships. And so I spend a lot of time trying to think about how what's showing up on like a subreddit actually reflects like anything from cybernetics to just-in-time production, like deindustrialization, like some weird justification for imperialism from like the 19th century, what have you. And so basically, this is also my dissertation work. I spend a lot of time thinking about what even is a personality. How did we come to think about a personality in the ways that we do? And I'd been doing this for a couple years, and I came to a place where I realized that I really needed a chapter on groups. I'd been thinking about the individual, and really the thing that I kept coming up against was that the limit of all of these concepts I was thinking about, so soft skills, the commodification of the self, boundaries, what have you, was that they were failing to grasp exactly how entangled personality is with everything that's going on around you. And so I started thinking a lot about groups, and this was early 2024, and a couple of other things were happening. One was that I was getting more involved with Palestine solidarity work, which I talk a lot about in the piece. And as many of you may know, organizing contexts tend to kick up a lot of complicated group dynamics. At the same time, some of my social groups were falling apart. So you can see how this intellectual interest starts to get a little bit personal, to the point where I might consider spending 2 weeks in the English countryside in a psychodynamic experiment. And I learned about the Leicester Conference specifically. So I knew what Tavistock was. I had a sense of this sort of intellectual context, but I didn't know that there was basically 2-week Beyond summer camp. And I learned about this from my friend, Michael Stablin, who's the real group expert. He actually studies the Proud Boys. So he comes to it from a very different angle.
Interesting.
Yeah. And what he was basically explaining to me about the Tavistock was that this is where management theory and psychoanalysis collide. So over the decades at the Tavistock, management theory and psychoanalysis sort of grew together and entangled themselves into this like kind of niche and very specific way of thinking about what happens with people in groups. And I had been looking at all of these pop psychology concepts and finding that they tended to move between management theory and psychotherapy contexts. And so I thought, oh, wow. There's a place where they've been doing this in a really rigorous and studied and often applied way for decades. I have to know what's going on there. And I'd already been planning to go to this other cult-like group self-transformation training, which I will not talk about because it derives from S and is extremely litigious. And I thought, oh, I will also put in these grant applications that I want to go to Tavistock, which will be this incredible, sophisticated counterpart. And so then I went, having gotten like 5 separate grants to cover the fee because it's very expensive. And I had my mind blown almost despite myself. I went in thinking this was a research thing, and then I left being like, oh no, I am very changed. I kind of resent that, summer camp could do this to me. And I mean, the way that I'll describe it up front is that if you think about normal therapy, and like to be clear, group relations is not therapy.
Yeah.
It rejects that label. But I think the analogy is valid. So if you think about normal therapy, like an analyst, a patient as like as like a line, like 2 points form a line. And then you think about group therapy as like a shape. So we take things onto a plane. Then group relations is like a four-dimensional hypercube. Like it just catches angles and dimensions of what it is to be a person that I actually think individual or group therapy in normal context cannot quite catch in the frame. Like you just are able to kind of get a different vantage point on like the architecture of your psyche and to experience that in your body. So I was totally bowled over. And I remember on the plane ride back thinking, oh God, how am I going to explain this to other people? All of my friends are going to think that I joined a cult. And at this point, I'd been radio silent on my phone for the full 2 weeks. And I was also having this weird experience of, I don't know if I really want to, like, I don't know what my relationship to writing is because writing is so solitary. And I think I was having this experience of like, oh, being in groups is actually like where life happens, where history happens. And I was like, what does it mean to go back and be in a room alone?
Yeah.
But what do writers do to things that are sacred to them and inarticulable in the end? Like over the course of a year, I kind of went back and forth with myself and then eventually wound up caving and being like, this is the most important craft challenge for me right now is like, how do I take this thing that is extremely difficult to make anyone understand who has not done it? Like I can tell you about it intellectually, but to take you through the felt experience of group relations is like maybe the hardest thing I've ever tried to do with language.
I mean, it's a beautiful essay. It really is. I
Yeah.
read it 4 times. I
Thank
marked
you.
it up many. I also felt like I think I had to work through a lot of like resistances in various parts of it also, but it succeeds in so many different ways. And I won't embarrass you by enumerating all of them, but I will ask you because you are an academic and I know you share my interest in defining your terms. Can we do a little ground clearing for the listeners? What is the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations? What is the Tavistock Conference? And what, in this context, does this phrase group relations, which I think can sound very innocuous, but what does it mean in this context?
So the Tavistock Institute started after World War II. It split off from the Tavistock Clinic, which you might be more familiar with, because the clinic, which really wanted to focus on treatment, was joining the NHS. And what was going on was during World War II, the Tavistock, when it was combined, had started doing some of these consulting projects and applying some of the research that was happening there to organizations around the world. And in order to keep doing that, when the clinic joined the NHS, they split off. And the Institute became this bastion of thinking and conversation on the topic of how groups of people come together to work on a task. And basically, Bion was an extremely major player there, but also Bowlby was very involved. And from the beginning, they were a research organization, but they were also putting that research into practice. And they were really interested in applying what they were learning about how groups worked from a psychoanalytic perspective in organizational context, from like the Glacier Metals Company to the National Coal Board. They took it to Ahmedabad. And so they were really learning about how groups were operating like in vivo in these contexts. And they were like learning from those contexts and then also bringing their learning to those contexts. And it's kind of like what they were doing is like high octane Maoism. So it's a way of thinking about what an organization should be and should be like for people working there, that's actually the opposite of Taylorism in some ways, though of course it's all part of this fantasy that good management can save the world.
Yeah.
But basically the idea is that you want to make work nice for workers. You want to make it so that workers find meaning in their work and that their relationships are sustaining. And the Tavistock takes this to the next level. And it says, not only do we need people to play nice and get along, we also want, like, basically to align their unconscious desire with the work task, or to get them like to do this sort of at the next layer down. So they're digging deep into the strata of like the structure of workers' psyches and like thinking about how to produce teams that gel at a level that is only accessible to the tools of psychoanalysis. And so the conferences start as a kind of petri dish for this work in, I think it's 1957. And so they design this kind of laboratory in which they can isolate group dynamics. And so what this looks like is you're getting a ton of people in a room. And at the beginning, it's mostly psychoanalysts and some business people. And you're giving them exactly no instructions. And then you're seeing what they do. And they do this for 2 weeks every year, straight through the present. Over time, it starts to go global. So people, they're very deliberately bringing people from other places and saying, look at this thing we're doing. And then those people will get excited about it and will start like, institutional bodies in their home countries that will start to host conferences. And so I think, these days there's group relations and obviously in the US, but also like China, Russia, Lithuania. There was group relations in Pinochet's Chile. There's group relations in Israel. It's become, and there's like some like slight soft power connotations there. Like group relations really will prod people to challenge authority. And so it's a little bit complicated. Like I think I don't know, I won't get too far into this right now. But yeah, so what the term group relations refers to is the Tavistock method in the broader field. So, the Tavistock is one organization, but group relations is the more general name for this practice.
You have that great line in your essay where you describe if McKenzie consultation is CBT for organizations, Tavistock's approach is psychotherapy for organizations, which I thought, one, cuts to the quick of understanding the difference between these kinds of like levels of advice. And two, it's also a little frightening to think about. I couldn't help but think about your Harper's piece about soft skills and the way organizations are trying to monetize our souls in a lot of ways, and to think about an organization going to an institute that's willing to give them the keys of psychoanalysis to try to do that. It's fascinating. It's also like a little terrifying.
It is absolutely terrifying. I also think I'm really of two minds here. I think originally I was like, oh God, they're trying to, rationalize and like get their fingers into the deepest nooks and crannies of ourselves. And we cannot allow this like social engineering project to continue, et cetera. But then I also have this feeling of like, what they actually do is deeply cool. Like the way that a Tavistock method consultant goes into an organization is they use their body as a weather vane. Like they're experiencing themselves as like an organ of emotion, like an instrument where they feel what it's like in the here and now to like arrive in the organization. They see how they're received, and they're doing all of this like basically they have like a sort of finely tuned sensorium of self-awareness for how they themselves are being used by an organization, which is how they then come to understand what is going on in that organization. So they're using themselves as an instrument in a way that I just find like weirdly beautiful.
Yeah.
But obviously it is this sort of, I would say it's very populated by libs. And can be applied in, ways we might support and ways we may not support. And the U.S. Army has used group relations and system psychodynamics methods quite a bit.
It's so interesting. There's like really, I'm thinking about the passage in Experiences in Groups, the Bion book, not your essay, where he talks about kind of handling the countertransference, and you can really draw a straight line from that, like where he understands his own emotions as data and is really confident that you can separate out certain sort of objective aspects of the countertransference versus the analyst's own kind of idiosyncratic responses, and is like, that the weather vane language isn't there, but yeah, again, a real straight line. Can we get really granular about what happens at a Tavistock conference? Like, what is the structure of a group relations conference like? And can you tell us a little bit more about your own experiences at Tavistock? And also, since you became, as you say, very, very invested in this method at the subsequent group relations conferences that you attended.
I went in totally cold, which I actually highly recommend, but I'm about to ruin that for you.
That's fascinating.
So, imagine that 2 weeks before, you receive an email that has a schedule, and it looks like a schedule of high school courses. So it says, 9:30 to 11 a.m., small study group, 11:15 to 12:45 a.m., large study group. And then there are these blocks that last from 9 a.m. until 9 p.m. every day of just these different kinds of groups that have acronyms. And you're like, what even is this? And it gives you a little bit of information, but it's all these abstract nouns. And so then 2 weeks later, like, I take this train to the English countryside. I arrive to this mock Tudor manor / conference center. And I go to the room where they say the opening plenary is going to be taking place. And I sit down in these rows of chairs, and there are maybe 50 people in the room, and they're all kind of giving psychoanalyst or corporate coded mid-career professional. And then right when the second hand hits the hour, approximately 12 people walk in a line, and they sit in an arc facing the rows of chairs very solemnly. And the director proceeds to give a little speech, and she tells us that the task is, quote, to study the exercise of authority and the taking up of roles in the conference setting. And I'm like, what does that mean? Like, it's like this abstract noun gobbledygook. I'm like, oh, what have I come to? And she's speaking like she's kind of like a gentle robot, is the impression that I'm getting. And I'm like, oh God, what did I walk into? And so then she says this thing, which is, and where would you like to begin? And we're 15 minutes into an hour-long block, and the room goes silent. And then people start saying things like, I'm really scared to be here. I've been waiting to be here for 10 years, and now I'm terrified. And then other people are saying, I put on pants this morning, and then I decided to change into a dress because I wanted to feel more feminine.
Yeah.
And people are saying all this stuff, and you're like, what is going on here? And so then this ends, and you leave and you go to the next thing you're assigned to go to, which is your small study group. And you walk into a room, and you sit in this ring of chairs, and there are 10 chairs. And one of the people in this room, you understand, is called a consultant. And this person's job is basically to sit there and observe you, and occasionally to say, like, to give a sense of what is happening in the room, like to provide their interpretation, which is often kind of like a cryptic koan. And besides that, there are no instructions.
Straight out of experiences in groups.
It's straight out of experiences in groups. Yes. And like, thankfully I've read experiences in groups. So I'm like, okay, I think I kind of know what's about to happen, but like, oh God, this silence is excruciating, because you're just sitting there waiting for someone to like nominate themselves to be the person who speaks first after like 10 minutes of tortured silence. So it's like kind of like this face off. And then it kind of always, and I've done at this point like maybe 5 conferences. And so you learn that there is this pattern where someone will do it, everyone will chuckle, people will do introductions. And then slowly things start to happen. And maybe 90 minutes later, people are saying things like, I feel like I'm your punishing father, or like I'm terrified to speak because I think someone might attack me, or like I'm jealous of how eloquently you said that because I have like a huge crush on Carl and I think you just impressed Carl. And people are doing all this stuff, and you're like, oh my God, how did this get this intense? And the way it got this intense is that there's this customary practice of speaking in the here and now, which we were doing at the top of the episode. There are no rules, to be clear, but the custom is to name what is happening for you in that moment, to sort of speak from the position of the feelings and thoughts that are and associations that are coming up for you based on what's happening in the room, which is basically like offering up your experience of the group as data for the rest of the group. And this is actually extremely difficult. Like, it feels often like kind of like trying to catch a fish with your bare hand. Like, you're like, oh God, what am I feeling? And it all really is about learning and study. And that's a really important thing to hold in mind. Like, it starts to really sound like the therapist's Olympics or like some kind of fight club. But what it really is that you learn to observe, like, in yourself as an individual, and also in sort of the broader, the system, as they call it, what happens when a bunch of people get in rooms together. Kind of clearing away the specificity of those rooms, which is kind of problematic, and we can get into that. And so basically, you're doing this all day, every day for 2 weeks. You go from small study group to large study group, where all like 50-ish people in the conference sit in a spiral and do exactly the same thing. The spiral allows people to kind of be closer together and to not face each other, and creates all these weird power dynamics. And this is kind of like the iconic image of Tavistock method conferences. And then you do something called the intergroup event, which starts with an exercise that feels like being picked for soccer teams, where everyone self-selects into groups and sort of goes off to study a theme in their groups. And then the groups interact with each other. And it sort of feels like this whole kind of contrived game, but that actually very helpfully models what happens in many organizations that have, like, you know, working groups or like teams in a more corporate context. So those are kind of the main here and now groups. And then at the end of the day, you'll have a review group, and then you will be absolutely wiped. You will feel like someone, like, you know, reached into your skull and like mashed up your brains with their fingers. And then you will crawl into bed and find that you cannot sleep for multiple hours because you're wired from having conversations all day.
Yeah.
And then you will do it again. And over time, what happens is that, and you're all living together, like, you're all in this like weird hotel conference complex. And so you kind of can't, it's like a total institution. Like, you can't, you're in an ant farm. Like, you can't get out of this system. And you find you start to have, like, I think a thing that people really ask me often is like, why do you care? Like, what makes you care? Like, these are just all of these strangers. Like, you can just kind of, like, you know, screw around and it doesn't matter. And what's terrifying, like maybe the scariest thing, is that you really do start to care. And it takes like 2 days. And then suddenly, like, you know, you're like ignoring texts from your best friend from home. And the only thing that matters is getting the approval of like this like one person in your intergroup group or something. And it's because, you know, everyone is sort of starting, like, basically what starts to happen is like projection accumulates in the system. And so you start to like a transference builds up. Like, everyone is experiencing one another through these templates from past relationships of theirs. But the thing is, everyone is doing this at once. And everyone is also starting to project things onto each other. So they're taking all of the feelings and elements of themselves that they don't want to feel, and they're locating them in other people. And they're finding certain people who sort of seem like, you know, it's like you're sort of sizing up a person and being like, is this person, like, does their personality make me associate them with this feeling I'm having? Okay, I'll project this feeling onto them and not someone else. But the thing is, because everyone's doing this, certain people start to take up roles, which is one of those annoying abstract nouns that they say at you that you can't make any sense of until you start to see, you know, everyone start to experience one person as really freaking annoying. And then that person becomes annoying because it kind of hooks into something in them and they identify with it. And you sort of see how the way that everyone in the group is experiencing you is kind of compounding and starting to move how you behave. So someone kind of becomes like the mom of the system, someone becomes like the clown of the system. And it becomes this sort of strange process that is not, no one's really choosing this. And it's just this kind of aggregative dance. And it's really mind blowing to be in. Like, you feel like you're living in a kaleidoscope and you can kind of feel how this is happening in your body. And this is like where it really starts to sound woo. But it's like you realize that you're always in this kind of hall of mirrors. Like, everyone's just in this massive dance of transference in their lives. And then what the group relations conference does is it kind of isolates that.
From the essay, Lily, it seems like two psychoanalytic concepts in particular, which you clearly like understood in a deep intellectual way going in, projection and transference, became real to you in a way that was categorically different. Is that right? Like in this sort of heightened state.
Yes, that is exactly how I would describe what happened. And I think to some degree, individual analysis does that too. Like, you might understand it intellectually, but once you're playing it out with an analyst in a room, you're like, oh, that's what transference is. But when you're doing it, and this is where the individual therapy is a line, group therapy is a polygon, group relations is a crazy hypercube, analogy comes into play, is like, it just is happening out of volume and to a degree of complexity and multidirectionality where you can kind of get around it. Like, you're like, oh yeah, that's what that is. And it's happening all the time.
You reach in the essay to religious language to describe this. We are already earlier in this conversation, we're using religious language to describe this. When I think about this like Tudor mansion and people, it does feel like a performance is all wrapped up in this, especially in the first few days, sizing each other up, trying to put on the best face you can, or whatever that experience must feel like. I think about like, feels like Hogwarts for thought leaders, but instead of spells, you're learning about like articulating the here and now. Which I'm a little obsessed with because it almost does feel a little magical that after a while being exposed to an environment like this, like in the early days of like magical thought or whatever, there is this thing swimming around that you can learn to tap into. Only it's not, supernatural. It's all these, I guess what Bion would call unthinkable thoughts. It's this like emotional morass that unless you harness language to use to describe it, you're just going to be trapped in those basic assumptions forever. You're just going to be swimming forever. It sounds fascinating. It sounds miserable, and it sounds really fascinating.
I really think it's no accident that Bion is like one of the analysts who wound up kind of late career getting a little bit woo. Like, I do really think that this kind of Tavistock method group is where psychoanalysis starts to get a little bit like freaky and paranormal. At the same time,
like if you didn't take the Jungian exit beforehand.
Exactly. Yeah. If you didn't take the Jungian turn off to, fascist land. No. There are some great Jungians out there, I'm sure. But what's also interesting is you can really break it down analytically. Like, you can really take the toolkit of psychoanalytic concepts, like this like scientific set of tools, and be like, oh, this is what's happening. And that's what's so powerful about it, is you have that intellectual apparatus to make sense of how crazy you feel while you feel it. And I think that's what's useful about it.
I want to talk a little bit about the political implications of this piece. This is a question, but I also want to read a couple of passages. It seems to me, Lily, that one of the things that a lot of your essays have in common is that you will tackle these ideas and structures that masquerade as apolitical, and demonstrate the ways in which they're like fundamentally political. So I'm thinking certainly about your work on attachment and on boundaries. I mean, we even got into talking about like John Locke and like property and like liberal political thought, right? The sort of subterranean like architecture of a lot of these terms that end up tossed around like, oh, he didn't call me back because he's avoidantly attached, right? But this essay rules out any reader's attempt to depoliticize group relations from the outset. So, I mean, it's first of all, it's woven through with your experiences in protests and encampments in spring of 2024. And it also, I mean, you're at great pains to detail the ways that Bion and other group relations researchers consulted for corporations like Shell and Unilever. But, Essay Lily, I'm like distinguishing between Essay Lily and Lily that I'm talking to right now. I mean, you can tell that she holds these intense hopes and these fervent desires for the promise of group relations, for individual ends and for political ends, and without wanting to like rigidly distinguish between those two things. So I want to ask you about those hopes and desires. But first, I want to read two passages for our listeners who haven't read the essay. And the first is primarily on that sort of like individual access, and the second primarily on the political one.
I love this first one, by the way. Yeah.
Quote, I felt split open, which I was told was a good sign. For Bion, the mind is a kind of container, able to safely hold a certain intensity of feeling and complexity of thought without rupturing. When the container breaks, you regress. But like a muscle, the mind grows stronger and larger by trying to hold too much, ripping and then knitting itself back together. We use groups to support our containment when it inevitably fails. You need to regress to grow, to feel shame to learn, and for this you need others. This promise of growth was what had brought me to group relations. In my admittedly reductive and desire-clouded reading of Bion, I wanted to recreate myself as a kind of bunker for feeling, or at least to be able to handle and respond effectively in the here and now to anything thrown at me in a group situation. If I was deft enough, I thought, I could avoid ever feeling alone. Close quote. Okay, so that's the first passage, and here is the second one. Quote, leaving the Tavistock conference, I had developed a somewhat embarrassing fantasy that becoming a group relations expert could help me become useful in either totalitarian circumstances or state collapse. I would become a sage navigator of the ant farm of the cadre, or the commune, or if need be, the political prison. I'd read and loved an endnotes essay that used Bion to analyze 20th century schisms in the left, but as far as I knew, no one had held group relations training specifically for leftists. Almost despite myself, I imagined that we could remodel a group relations conference for social movement work, sloughing off the buzzwords and making it aesthetically and politically palatable, spawning an elite core of here and now experts. What if we could have pressed pause on the encampment and rearranged everyone's camp chairs into a spiral? Group relations would be less destructive than Cesar Chavez's experiments with Synanon attack therapy, less remedial than consciousness raising, less stringent than unity struggle unity. Maybe if everyone at the encampment had done group relations, things would have gone a little better. We might have had a little more patience with ourselves and one another, a little more awareness about when our conflicts over strategy were alibis for emotional needs, or our interpersonal squabbles were ways to avoid the daunting task at hand. I don't want to get too optimistic. Most group relations people I talk to do not believe that the method is a messianic vehicle for social repair. They do tend to believe that it's a practice of penetrating any, quote, very powerful silence that does not allow learning to move, close quote, as one consultant put it. Something many institutions could learn from, including group relations organizations themselves. When the New York Center for the Study of Groups, Organizations, and Social Systems put out a letter calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, it faced immediate blowback from the group relations community for contaminating the sterile laboratory conditions of the work with politics. Even groups of experts on groups can struggle to confront the here and now. Close quote. Okay, there's so much in there, but I really just wanted our listeners to be able to hear, bits of the essay out loud. But can you tell me a little bit about your hopes and desires regarding group relations, which sounds to me also like are getting expressed in work with a new group?
Yeah. So a lot of people, when they first start doing group relations, leave their first conference and think, oh my God, this method can save the world. And depending on their politics, which are likely pretty like liberal, progressive, they will have different, they will populate this fantasy with a different set of images. And, a lot of the time, because this is about getting groups to work together well, this can be a fantasy of like repair and reconciliation. So like, you imagine like senators reaching across the aisle, if only we could put them all in a group relations conference, et cetera, et cetera. And, so once you do group relations for a while, I think this gets a little bit tempered, especially if you're like around, the actual organizations that run it, which themselves are sort of full of complexity, which is not in any way disavowed, which is what's cool about it. But I was not immune to this fantasy. I just had a leftist version of it. And I think I had real hesitation about feeling like it had this promise because of some of the more nefarious uses. Like, some guy I met at a conference, like basically it has a really long history of being used by like the US Army in particular. But like, of course, like Bion was a military guy. Like the whole method grew out of work he was doing in like officer selection and training.
And his background with tanks, right? Talk about your high pressure small group experiences.
Totally. Yeah. He's like literally, I mean, it's like being in a room in a manor is nothing compared to like being in a metal container with a bunch of dudes who think they're going to explode at any moment.
Yeah.
So I was very aware of all these uses. I mean, there was one guy that I met at a conference who was, when the USS Cole got bombed in 2000, I think. He was the military psychiatrist who got sent in to like the ship to do therapeutic work with the people on board to try and keep them sane and keep them from panicking after they just watched like a ton of the crew die and were like waiting to potentially get bombed again. And like he was a Tavistock method dude. And so like it's all over the place in military history in particular. It's all, like in Israel, like there's a real like both sides fantasy that gets played out in these group relations conferences. So I had these hesitations. At the same time, I'm not the first person on the left to fantasize about using the Tavistock method in this way. Like there's this really incredible endnotes essay that takes a lot of Bion's ideas and uses them to think about 20th century social movement dynamics. And obviously the left has its own body of systems of thought for thinking about what is happening in groups. So yeah, consciousness raising, criticism, self-criticism, like, ideas from labor organizing, like I'm thinking of like Jane McAlevey. And so why would we want to go to this kind of formal, kind of, implicitly centrist, like external body of thought that was like forged by this weird institute and bring that in? And I think that really it's not, like I think my fantasy is not that it would be used like consciousness raising. Like I don't think that group relations is actually great for process work in an existing social movement organization that needs to continue to work together, because I think speaking in the here and now can be quite escalatory. I think if I have fantasies about it, it's that I think GR does kind of give you a sixth sense for like how a group is a complex system and how there's all this secret stuff going on that's kind of hard to detect and describe. And all of, like often people are kind of in unconscious feedback loops of various kinds that are actually keeping things stuck and then attributing the cause of the stuckness to something else. And you start to learn to feel that in your body and to experience it intuitively rather than just saying like, oh, okay, well, this like structural dynamic or like form of systemic violence is at play, which like is extremely real. And I think also group relations is very helpful in like making sense of the more like historical and political dimensions of like, system level group effects. But I think it also really in particular, group relations is useful in helping people get over the need to blame an individual, whether that's themselves or something else, for something that's happening in a group. Like I think something I've seen time and time again is this like oh, like this person is being so annoying. They keep derailing the meeting, or they're like acting out, or they're creating conflict. And if only we could get rid of this problem person, then everything with the group would be okay. And, sometimes sometimes it is the individual. Like sometimes you just have an extremely toxic boss. Sometimes like someone actually does have like, I don't know, like a untreated personality disorder. But like a lot of the time what's actually happening is that the group is using this person and behaving in some way, like colluding unconsciously to make a person act in a way that is serving some unconscious desire on behalf of the group. And this sort of is where things start to sound really woo. And I think if you look at it, like Bion's experiences in groups, he has like a lot of like his theoretical system is really helpful for making sense of what that means. And, I think it's also not just like how do we re-engineer social movement organizations on the left, but I think it's also really useful in making sense of what's going on in groups we don't like my friend who studies the Proud Boys. Like, I think that's also worth having a vocabulary that can be put to use parsing it. But anyway, I think I was really lucky to I feel like I did GR weirdly at a moment when everyone around me was starting to become extremely invested in these questions, which I think was really related to Palestine solidarity work and like other more general phenomena on the left. But I came home and I immediately after that happened to be moving to New York. I moved to New York. Like 4 days later, I wind up at these drinks that Hannah Zeven, who I knew through writing from Parapraxis, was hosting, where I meet immediately Sumitra Rajkumar, who you've had on the pod. And we get into this wild conversation about like, group relations as a lens on social movement work versus somatics as a lens on social movement work. And then in that conversation, like I meet Ari Brostov, and then suddenly like Ari and Hannah wind up starting this thing called Groups Group, which is like a small collective that is like working to research group dynamics in social movement context specifically, and is like largely psychoanalytically oriented, but is pulling from a lot of different methods and theories to try and like work on this problem. And that has been an exceedingly meaningful place to pick up some of these questions and really like work on them with comrades in a targeted way. And I mean, it's interesting. Like I do think that group relations it has been a source for me of like some very important friendships and comradeships. Like I'm thinking of like JJ Mull and Hannah Bayer, particularly, who have been in group relations work for much longer than me, and from whom I have just learned so much about how groups work. I mean, I think it's been really cool to start thinking about these things as an individual, get really obsessed with groups in the process, and then wind up finding a group that specifically could become an incubator for this kind of thinking on groups. And I think that it kind of speaks back to that feeling I was having about writing coming back from Tavistock, where I was like, why am I doing this? Do I really want to build my life around thoughts I'm having alone? And I think that I've been lucky to find a context in which that thinking is not happening alone. And I think by and large, like that's reflected in the essay.
That all makes so much sense. I keep I don't mean to go back to the quotes that Abby just read from your essay, but that line, but like a muscle, the mind grows stronger and larger by trying to hold too much, ripping and then knitting itself back together. We use groups to support our containment when it inevitably fails. You need to regress to grow, to feel shame to learn, and for this you need others. I don't think in the context of this essay, I don't think I've seen a few sentences sum up so much of what is hard about group life, like retroactively, like set it in such stark refrain and make it so much easier to kind of wrap my head around than that. It's really remarkable writing. It's really, yeah, I'm getting a little emotional, so I'm going to stop. Go ahead, Abby.
I'm getting a little emotional, he said.
Like, I'm trying to be in the here and now, yo. Let's do it.
No, it was just,
I'm getting a little emotional too. I'm blushing. Yeah.
I'm thinking about the sort of, I was going to say the fundamental fantasy, but maybe a fundamental fantasy of the first passage of sort of like, what can group relations do for the individual? And I'm thinking about conversations that Dan and I have had, and we'll get into this more in a little bit, but Bion and experiences in groups was important for both of us. And it was something that I asked Dan to read a long time ago. It became, pretty pivotal in his life. I'll let him tell that story.
She was like, he's insufferable in groups.
No,
Let's get him educated.
Oh, stop it. You asked me for more reading on groups.
That's fair.
Don't confabulate here. Dan's role in the group is to be self-deprecating, and we won't allow it. We're not going to take it anymore.
But if Dan is self-deprecating, then we don't have to feel bad about ourselves. So
I know. There is that. But
thanks, Dan.
You're welcome.
But what I was going to say is that, and again, I won't speak for Dan, but I'll speak for myself, is that reading experiences in groups, which I did in grad school, not because it was assigned, but just because I stumbled upon it. And I was like, I'm a person that reads fiction on the subway. Like, I don't take my work with me everywhere. I was carrying experiences in groups everywhere and annotating it. And I brought it to a job interview. I remember really clear, like an adjunct job interview. I remember sitting in the Cooper Union waiting for somebody to see if they would pay me, $4,000 per class. And holding on to my security blanket of experiences in groups, because it had, I found it. I haven't been to a Tavistock group, but I found it really a life-changing book. It's just up there for me with Freud, and with books like Fear and Trembling. That's another book that just rocked the foundations of everything that I thought, right? But I think part of it for me was the sense of if I understand the basic assumptions at work in a group, if I'm conscious of these things of which I was previously unconscious, I will be able to elude, all of the traps into which everybody else falls when they're in groups. And it seems to me so interesting listening to you talk and reading you on your experience in Tavistock that you seem to vacillate between those two things. And Tavistock seems to have given you both this sort of fantasy of what if we knew better? We could arm our sensoria, right, with these extra, I'm thinking of a cat's whiskers, right? The way that they are sensitive to everything that's going on in the world. What if we could become so super sensitized to these group dynamics that we could in some way overcome them? And yet at the same time, what's happening is that the same thing happens over and over, and even people who are group relations experts lose themselves in the group, find themselves being worked on by the group. And then there's this way in which the group exceeds the individual and kind of skews the individual's perception of themselves as some sort of discrete entity, such that that's during the experience of the group relations conference. It's an untenable thing to understand yourself as you said, a monad. But you're also trying to do it, right? You're just you're a monad with whiskers. But do you know what I mean? It's it seems so interesting that the fantasy is there, but the group relations conference is at every moment militating against you really believing in that fantasy.
Yeah, and I think that's the beautiful contradiction. And I think I'm so aware, it's people will veer between believing this and sort of describing it as CrossFit for Bion heads, and being this is not training, this is not therapy. We are not here to better ourselves as individuals. We are here merely to study in the abstract. And, I do have this fantasy of taking every monad in the world and putting whiskers on it.
I'm so sorry about that image.
I will never let it go. And at the same time, I am well aware of all of the times that I have been totally and utterly bowled over by some dynamic that is happening in a group. Every time I've been impatient in a group, every time I have behaved in a way where I'm I'm being anti-task right now, And it's kind of that same thing of having done a lot of therapy and watching yourself act out and being oh, I know what I'm doing and I can stop it, but I'm doing it. And that's kind of where it leaves you. Like, you're not going to become, I think I do have my elite core of here and now experts fantasy. And I do really think that doing GR has made me a much more skilled group member. But I'm still like, if we're all on these little dinghies on like the massive tide of like unconscious group feeling, like you could still hit a wave and get capsized, but like you've been in the water a little more and you have a little bit of more of a sense of like fluid dynamics, maybe.
There is also a sense in where what Bion is putting down and experiences in groups, and what if obviously I haven't been to the Tavistock thing yet, but that
Dan's going to
it's
fill
not
out grant applications as soon as we're done with this recording.
Yeah,
I hope you go.
that would be fun. Well,
Wait,
or maybe
you and
not.
I can go. We can't take Patrick.
If you go, I want to come.
Group trip to groups.
Psychoanalysis, I'm going to speak for myself. Psychoanalysis generally has a kind of prosthetic appeal to it, where I'm going to learn tools of meaning making that are going to help me navigate day-to-day, like intra conflict and outer conflict in a new, fresh, interesting way, where I can kind of like take these feelings that I'm feeling, or these feelings that I'm feeling like projected onto me, and know what to do with them. And for Bion, I think I came to Bion thinking, like, I don't know, Freud and Klein helped me think about myself and how I look at the world when I'm alone. And Bion is going to help me when I enter into a group with people and to like navigate that emotional complexity. And it's like the more you read Bion, the more you kind of come away with this idea that you're actually never not in a group, that when you're alone trying to deal with these complex issues that are going inside of your head, trying to deal with your intense feelings, that's also group dynamics, and you need to kind of wrap your head around the fact that you're never really going to be alone, which is such a powerful, fascinating, interesting concept. And I feel like that might be in a nugget part of for me, part of the appeal to this is that kind of recognition that like you're not alone in your own head. There are other people in there with you. And maybe like part of the appeal, like why I feel a drive to want to find community, why I'm out maybe at the bar too often or whatever, is because being alone with those you people is a little bit more difficult than having other people to kind of throw them onto. Does that make sense?
I thank you so much for saying that, because something that has really been kind of the main thing I've been ruminating on this year is like my own work conditions. And like, I think this is true of all like freelancers, gig workers broadly, in ways that are often like much worse than those of us that are freelance writers, etc. But like what atomization does to us is it like leaves us in rooms alone, and we think that we are ungrouped. We think we don't have a group. But what actually happens, and like this is exactly what you're saying, Dan, and it's like in Freud's group psychology essay, is that like if you don't have a group of people around you, you become that group. Like parts of you, like, conjure up all these parts of yourself that then haunt you. And I think that, in this moment, like we are offered social media in particular, but also like all different manner of platforms and tools as like prostheses for generating that kind of like neurotic persecutory group. Like I feel like I'm kind of living in this like underneath this pantheon of sort of strange parasocial figures that like constitute my colleagues in some ways. And it's like some of them I have more intimate relationships with and I'm like emailing with all the time, or maybe like, I obviously like have friends, but then I think like so much of what happens like with the labor conditions that I am in and people around me is that you're sort of interacting with these figures in your mind all day.
Yeah.
And maybe it actually like, I think group relations definitely can help us make sense of that too. But I think a lot of people, and I think this is kind of some of the like loneliness epidemic discourse, would want to blame that on like, oh no, we're all terrified of groups. We all have too much social anxiety and we're like avoiding all of the like horrifying things that happen to us consciously and unconsciously when we're in a group of people, because it reminds us of like the middle school cafeteria. And I think there's something to that, but I think much more than that, it's like really about material conditions and shifting labor dynamics that are forcing us into like these like really like neurotic states.
wanted to see for the rest of the episode if we could if I can take you off the hot seat, Lily, and rather see if we can kind of noodle through some ideas that have come up through this conversation, but also that are provoked by reading Bion and thinking about your essay, and also by, I don't know, being a person in the world who is, as Dan pointed out, citing Bion, always in groups, even if the groups aren't visible. And why is it so hard to be in groups? That might sound like a naive question, but, I do teach philosophy, and a lot of what we do is ask naive questions and see if we can, noodle around some answers to them. But why is it? What do you think? And I guess I'm not just talking about groups in which one feels firmly ensconced, right? I belong to this church. I am a member of the U.S. Armed Forces, or I am an employee of this corporation. But also, thinking more broadly about things that Dan has already brought up about belonging or not belonging, about loneliness, alienation, whether the group is physically present or not.
My immediate association actually is that same week that I moved to New York, my roommate who came with me from Chicago and I went looking for apartments. And one of the apartments we toured, every surface was made of marble. It was drastically under market price. And we were like, why is it under market price? This seems really fancy. But it was the floors are marble, the walls are marble, the ceiling is marble. And we walk in, and I think I say, wow. And then the room goes, wow, 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 wow. And the echo is crazy. And we're immediately oh, we cannot live here. This is hell. And I think that in a group, there is a similar effect that happens with your unconscious, where you feel you're in this crazy echo chamber. So maybe, I don't know. I think that's how I think of it.
I want to return to your essay and that line that Abby read that I reread. There does seem to be at the heart of Bion's study here this kernel of an idea that to grow means to suffer a little bit. And it's suffering that it's suffering that I guess in retrospect, when I think about the groups that I belong to in my life, they're not always groups. For one thing, you self-select for groups. Sometimes I go out and I look for a group that agrees to certain things. Then there are groups that you are a part of, whether you want to be a part of them or not. And in fact, your way of interacting with that group is by telling yourself, these aren't my people. I'm not a part of this group or whatever, which is, I don't know, setting you up for another kind of suffering, or maybe setting you up to live in those basic assumptions, to not actually be mature enough to be able to process these emotions that you're feeling, this rejection or whatever. And then that Lovecraftian horror of the fact that when you're alone, you're still in all those groups. You're still swimming in all of that in your own head. And that maybe that loneliness that you're feeling is almost like a self-rejection in some way, in some light. It does feel like group life is suffering. And when I think about that, I think about how my different text groups that I've got a lot of large text threads with people, and I punctuate my language differently in every single one of them. Even the tiny things do I end this sentence with a period, or does it get 2 exclamation points? Depends on the people that I'm talking to and the role that I play as a part of that group membership. It just complicates so much. It complicates so much, and sometimes that complication is lovely and wonderful and expansive, and other times it's suffering. It hurts.
I was thinking about, this makes me think about the classroom, because a lot of things make me think about the classroom. But I was thinking about the ways in which, even though what Lily's describing, walking into a Tavistock conference, the opening lines, or pretty close to opening lines of experiences in groups where Bion is I take this opportunity to do nothing, when everyone's kind of looking at him expecting, aren't you going to start the group? Even though that's strange, that's an unusual, and as you said, off-putting or awkward or uncomfortable sensation. Most of our non-work groups actually are like that. They don't have any stated purpose, right? And so what Bion calls the basic assumptions come to the forefront. Like if Dan and Patrick and I get together and, for once we aren't working on the podcast, we're just like hanging out, like we don't have an agenda, right? Like I haven't made and circulated an agenda, hopefully.
Today we're going to regress. Let's do it.
But, it strikes me that some of what makes a lot of the groups that we have to be in on a day-to-day basis when we go to work and whatnot tolerable is that there is an agenda, whether or not it's stated. I was thinking about also, do you mind if I tell you about something that I do in class or that I did last week when I was teaching consciousness raising, actually, in my intro to gender, women's, and sexuality studies class?
Oh, please.
I designed this. This is actually appropriate because hopefully I won't lose my voice because I have to teach a lot of classes tomorrow. But when I get sick, I get laryngitis, which is actually not a great thing for a person whose income comes from being a professor and a podcaster.
In a GR context, they would consider that to be interpretable.
Oh, it's totally interpretable.
Yeah,
it's definitely interpretable. Yeah.
Your students are doing that to you.
I definitely believe there is some sort of symbolic function to the fact that when I get sick, I lose my voice, for sure. And I also think that I made myself become a podcaster because my deepest fear is of having nothing to say. And thus I just have to put myself in a situation over and over and over again to prove, thank goodness this is behind the paywall. There's this story, okay, this is like nested stories, but again, it's behind the paywalls, that after she wrote her first novel, Simone de Beauvoir, which is terrible. Simone de Beauvoir was like, after this was published, I realized that like I always had something to say. And that has like lingered with me as this moment where like, what is that like? That's my fundamental fantasy. You always believe that you have something, worthwhile to say. But okay, so I get laryngitis and I do this one class session where we talk about consciousness raising. And one year I had complete laryngitis. I could not talk, like just not even a little bit. And I had assigned this primary document from a consciousness raising group in Connecticut. Guidelines. Like, here are some guidelines. Here's how you run a consciousness raising group. And at the end, there's a caveat that's like, anything that doesn't work for you in here, like throw it out. But it's a totally fascinating document. And so much of what it's about is, how are we supposed to be in groups? It starts out being like, this isn't a political group. It's not a social group. It names like all the kinds of groups that it isn't. Totally fascinating document. And there's a suggestion that to make the group function better so that, people like me who love to like jump in all the time don't dominate the conversation, and people like Dan who are constantly like, wait, do I have something to add? While secretly having like tons of things to add all the time. Dan's shaking his head at me, but he's wrong. Like that they, feel that they owe the group something, right? So everyone gets poker chips. And whenever you want to speak, instead of just talking, you throw your poker chip into the center of the room. This is even more overdetermined because one year I couldn't find my poker chips and I borrowed Dan's, and I've had them for like 4 or 5 years and I keep not giving them back. But so I wrote up, because I couldn't talk, I wrote up a whole set of instructions for my students. It was like, hey, like I can't talk, but you know what? That's fine because this is all about non-hierarchical groups. So it's actually better that you can't get anything from me because I cannot talk. So get in small groups and go talk about this document. And I gave them some questions, and then get in a big group and use the poker chip method. And so I only later realized that this is fundamentally like a Bionian more than a consciousness raising, like inspired experiment, even though it does, it actually does work really, really well. And it often like marks a turning point for its students because they look at you and they're like, but I want you to do it. And you're just like, I'm not going to do it. Like, I made a lesson plan. But it's all on you and there is no recourse. You have to figure out how to lead your own group. And it's a really a great way of them trying to inhabit all of the inevitable problems that come up when a group has to self-organize, which of course most groups do have to self-organize. We just, have stuff frequently like lesson plans and leaders and Robert's Rules of Order and all those kinds of things to guide this. It's kind of amazing to watch them do this. And it's so hard for me also because I have to, unless I actively have laryngitis, I have to shut up. I have to sit there and be like, class is happening. And sometimes it's not going great. Sometimes they're not following the instructions.
They have to sit in it.
I just have to sit in it. If it goes really off, I do have chalk. I'll just write on the board like, hey, maybe consider doing this. But it has been, a really fascinating way for me to think about the role that I play in a classroom and what role I want to. But yeah, that's just something that I was thinking about as we were getting ready. Because it shouldn't be such an anomaly to be like, hey, like you have everything that you need. You can do this. And then you can you watch the group dynamics. And I now do a debrief because otherwise, there's no kind of sense of like making sense of what this is like. But yeah, I thought I would throw that out there as an experience that I have in groups.
I think this is kind of why group relations isn't a cult, because it shows you what happens when you remove authority and it forces you to learn to kind of sit with that discomfort. So like, I think everyone wants to be like, group relations is a total cult, and it does have some similarities in that, like, it has like a special jargon. It's a total institution when you're actually in it. But it's really, in some ways, it's like a meta cult or like inoculation against cults, because it specifically is doing this thing where it's like, wait, like, what is authority? Like, is authority like a weird sticky substance that's sort of being apportioned between people? Does anyone really, quote unquote, have it? Like, what is it made of? Oh, it's made of projection.
Yeah.
Something about your story, Abby, made me think about, at least for me, part of the joy I get from groups is not having to talk. And like, you can kind of turn your brain off a little bit. You can slip into a role. And when you do speak, it's like a privilege. You get to do this thing. I don't feel like I'm like stepping on people. I know like a little while ago, I used to work like a pretty massive like corporate job, and reading Bion helped me quit it. And for me, like Bion, it wasn't even about the group dynamics aspect. Like I was better able to retrospectively think about maybe it's a massive thousands and thousands of people financial company, trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars. So it is the world's tallest pancake stack of layers and layers of management. So for things to get done, it's very slow. It's very slow. And you have to navigate a lot of emotional minefields and politics. And you have to know just the right words to say when you're telling somebody that you actually needed something else. I'm sorry. You didn't quite come up to par, and you have to manage people. And I thought when I read Bion that this is going to help me navigate all these basic assumptions. I'm not functioning at a basic assumption. They all are. And I'm going to be able to navigate all these things like I'm a superhero. This is going to be my cape. And yeah, I'll be a better professional. I'll get more work done. What it actually did in reality was, one, holy shit, am I in a lot of basic assumptions? And am I in a different one or two or three in every group that I'm a part of? And that was like a lot of self-reflection that had to happen. And then the thing that eventually ended up making me want to walk away from that was Bion helped to define for me what the work of a career like that actually is. Like, where is the labor in this thing? It's often it wasn't the stuff I was paid to do. The work was actually navigating all of these basic assumptions that were swimming around. And for some people, they have the equipment to like be able to tolerate that kind of labor. And my upbringing in another kind of group, like fundamentalist religion, kind of set me up as an adult to not have the tools to be able to navigate like corporate basic assumption needs, being like programmed to want to wallow in some of that stuff from time to time. So yeah, it's like another layer that I found Bion really helpful for. Like, what are we all trying to do, and what is actually expected of me when it's not necessarily the work that I'm being paid for?
That's so well said.
Yeah, I know. I think we're both just sitting with that, being like, yeah.
I almost like, and maybe this is too much to ask, but like I almost want you to break down like how you saw those basic assumptions showing up. Like I'm wondering, like, like you finish experiences in groups, you go to bed, you wake up the next morning, you walk into the office and you're like, yes. Like what does that actually look like?
Well, have we all read experiences in groups more than once? I don't want to put anybody on the spot. The first time I read Bion, like I said, it was that like, I'm going to staple these pages together and make a cape, and it's going to be a superpower. This is going to be my tool. And I think I went into, it's like I said, I think I went into the office one day ready to try to suss out like, okay, when they made this announcement that this team is going to fuse with this team, and these two managers are going to co-lead this team, and the entire team is hanging on their every breath and giggling and all this kind of stuff. Oh, clearly there's like a pairing thing going on. So how can I use my words to try to get around like what essentially is kind of becoming a little bit of like any managerial oriented organization is going to have cults of personality. There's going to be like strong leaders and weak leaders, and they're always going to be pushed up against each other. And the work is always going to veer away from the work that you're meant to be doing and towards the work of managing all those energies. It was a lot of that. And it was also this like really sinking feeling of realizing, oh, I have one group of, say, this like divisional organization, and this is clearly a dependency thing. There's this charismatic leader at the top that's feeding all of these people, and everybody feeds off of this thing. But then you have like the step lower than that, where it could be a fight flight thing, where like this division's edging in on this division's thing. And then you have this fight or flight thing. And then you have this other layer inside of that of like your local team, where for me, it was like a designer working with a team of developers. And some days it was like a very, like we were comrades fighting against a system that was stacked against real labor being done. And other days it was like, I'm fighting with them and they're fighting with me. And the sheer complexity of it all. Like it feels like the Tavistock experience, this conference going experience, for me, the thing that seems the most frightening and also the most intriguing is that transition from the big group to the little group, back to the big group, and seeing all those layers of those dynamics kind of play out in real time, especially that like the cinnamon roll of chairs that you describe. Oh my God, fascinating. I would love to go. I don't actually want to go back. I'm very happy not being in corporate life anymore. But if I did, I would want to try making a big divisional team meeting with just a huge spiral of chairs and see who picks to go where and see how that affects the conversation going forward. I think that's like really fascinating.
The one time that I sat in the middle in a spiral, like truly in the middle in the center chair, like I was like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it this time. Let's go. Let's go. Let's go. I sit there and like within like 5 minutes of the start of large group, this guy turns to me and says, you have a very expressive face and dark forearm and leg hair, and I am turned on by you.
That's aggressive.
Yeah. I felt like a crazy wave of shame, which I then named. And then like every like woman in the room like raced to become the sort of like maternal defender of the young girl, and then I was like, guys, stop. Like, this is like weird feminism. I don't want this. Like, but it was crazy. Like, I was like, oh yeah, if you sit in the middle, you're going to get like the snipers will come out.
You have two stories in your essay that really stood out. One was that one. The other one was, I think he's named Will in the paper. This person who, after a while of meeting in groups with this person, if I'm getting it wrong, let me know. But after a while meeting with this person, you eventually found out, or they identified as being a Trump supporter. And it was like, for reasons that I think you do a very fair job of representing in the paper. And it brought me back to, we can't help but talk about our experiences here. So I'm going to talk about my experiences. It brought me back to like leaving a very close-knit religious community and for a period, you almost have to go through a Boolean switch of, am I going to hold it against these people as members of a group that I now recognize have done me a lot of harm? Or am I going to choose to see individuals in this group who were doing what, not only what they thought was right, but what they thought was morally right, or that they would be held responsible as being bad people if they hadn't done these things? You know what I mean? Like they have a drive in them that I can no longer understand as an outsider from their group. And it reminded me, it's a terrible, disgusting idiom. It's bad, and I hate it every time I hear it. But when these kinds of religious communities come up against, like specifically Christians come up against like the queer community, and they have that rote thing that they say, love the sinner, hate the sin. And I can't help but, after reading that story about Will, this thought popped in my head of whether or not Bion would say something like, love the individual, hate the group. If there's like some kind of a dynamic at play there that we could maybe learn from. Like, because I really appreciated reading your interactions with this guy, Will.
Amazing line. Love the individual, hate the group. I wonder if he would say that.
From how you described his motivation to be there was, it seemed like he was doing some consciousness checking. Like he wanted to see if this was authentic in himself, and he wanted to see what would be reflected back at him. But at the end of the day, even when people are sharing and he's performing this openness, at the end of the day, he still is fixed inside of some kind of a group that's giving him something that this smaller group is not fulfilling at all.
Yeah. So Will is part of this group of dudes. It's like this sort of like friend group of bros that will serially go to group relations conferences around the US. And the way that he actually put it to me was like in the same way that like some groups of guys go to Las Vegas.
That's like a whole new type of guy for me reading. I was like, it's a new kind of guy. I mean, new to me.
They're all like therapists who, I think they're all therapists who like trained in wilderness camps. So you can kind of start to piece together this genre of person, which I did not know existed. And they all, like, I don't know if they're all Trump guys, but they all like slightly, like once I kind of heard this from, I was like, oh, I see what's going on here. Like they have a real like anti-woke stance. And I think like we kind of left, like they were like kicking up enough, irritating, like anti-woke sentiment at this conference that when they left, we were kind of like, are they trolling us? Like, are they here to like kind of, prove to themselves that the left is like a bunch of, is like, I don't know, the thought police or something like, and so I wound up basically when I was writing this piece, I was like, I have to call Will, who I had built this like weirdly tender relationship with, because like I think we both kind of were like, oh, like we've both done a lot of these groups before. Like we both are like really interested in the way the other person engages. Like I felt like he kept really aggressively directing and like redirecting anything that was thrown at him as sort of into sort of like a tender question. And this sort of, it was very therapist-y, and I became extremely determined to force him out of this. And then we kind of played a little game together. And then at the end of this, he was like, I actually supported Trump. And he had this whole like really here and now thing of like, I felt left behind and I feel left behind in some of these contexts. And I feel like this, like, and was really like owning a lot of stuff in a kind of he was like, I experienced him as tearing up, and then really appealed to me for like, are you still going to be my buddy? And I was kind of like, like,
yeah.
Love the group, hate the individual, love the individual, hate the group. Like, I don't know. Like, I don't know how to respond to this in this context. Like, and then I felt this need to get on the phone with him after the conference and be like, okay, why were you there? What were you doing? And he kind of talked about like having a genuine curiosity about like what it would be like to inhabit that role and to sort of take like to experience himself in that societal position. And then he also was talking about kind of this like hedonism of group relations. Like I think he very earnestly has a lot of curiosity, but he was also like, I love the intensity of it, which is understand like it is kind of fulfilling. But he was talking about, and I thought this was really interesting. He was talking about going to one conference and deliberately making everyone hate him. basically by being reactionary in some of those ways, and how when the conference ended, he was left sitting alone in the room and everyone loathed him. And he felt this intense rush of power. Like he said he felt the most euphoric he'd felt in his entire life. And then immediately on the heels of that, he felt the saddest he felt in his entire life. And he said, okay, this is a really interesting experiment and I never want to do it again. And he was like, after that, I really tried to like think about what would be meaningful to bring to groups. And I think this is kind of the thing about the here and now is like people start to think about GR as attack therapy. But really what you learn to do is kind of to think about, okay, how do I use what I'm feeling right now and bring it to the group in a way that is both honest and also actually helps the group do work together and offer something up rather than like clobbering them with something. And I don't think he really necessarily got that right in the end. But I do think there is like, it is interesting because like that is one thing you can do with group relations conferences is you can show up and be like, okay, I'm going to behave in a way that I would never behave in my actual life and see what happens. And I think that's cool. But then sometimes you get people who behave in really terrible ways.
I mean, I suppose there's like a bizarre sort of freedom in the way that he was playing it, right? The sort of like, I play a certain role in other contexts. Why don't I come and try out this new version of myself? But of course, like since so much of what group relations teaches us is, you don't choose the role. the role chooses you. One does have to wonder how different that role was. I don't know. I was thinking like because I don't want to end with this figure of Will.
Yeah.
Right. I don't want that to be our last word here. I was thinking about Dan's story about Bion and how for me as a person, like, I mean, I spend a lot of time in groups of 10 to 20 people because those are the size of classes that I teach. So, there are 3 groups that I run. They're not groups, they're classes, but they're still groups. They're discussion-based classes. And, one of the things that I think that reading Bion has done for me is really helped me give myself a certain amount of grace, like not only in understanding that like the explicit function of the group, which is to get there and like learn things. And, there's learning outcomes and we can assess them and we can figure out did the stated function of the group, did it fulfill its function? We can do that. And there's all sorts of committees and whatever that's there to like then check on whether or not that happened. But, if you take what Bion is saying about how the function of the group is generally not the same thing as its stated purpose, if you're in a situation to be where you're leading a group or you're in charge of groups, it gives you a certain amount of grace and being like, this isn't about me. Right. And I'm just seeing the teeniest bit of how people are reacting to the stated purpose. I might not have any access whatsoever to the basic assumption. And there might be multiple basic assumptions. And that might be so much more important, consciously or not, to everyone else in this room. I don't know. That realization gave me like a lot of comfort. It didn't make me change how I would give myself a certain amount of responsibility for making sure that things happen. Right. But when they didn't, I had a different set of answers or possibilities for why the work group wasn't focused on work.
It really helps you take things less personally.
Yeah.
I'm trying not to be doomer, but this might be a little doomer. I think all 3 of us here were part of either the first or very close to first generation to grow up with the internet.
Yeah.
And like for me, it was like AOL Instant Messenger back in the day. Like you're talking about this experience of going to the conference and sitting in a room, sitting in feelings, sitting in that like morass that's washing around, being in the basic assumption lava lamp and having to feel like it's glow or whatever metaphor. I feel like it's a hard and truth reality that young kids these days have to. I think that a lot of their first group experiences outside of the family are going to be online. like going to be in video game chat lobbies or Discord.
Servers.
Yes, it's all going to be these online platforms where they're building up communities and where the emotional element of that group membership generates way more from inside of you, your imagination of these people that you're interacting with, and not so much with sitting in a room with people. And when I hear about kids coming to school, especially like after COVID, and having to sit in that emotional complexity for the first time, and that it is not just difficult, but like it can be terrifying. Like they don't understand what's happening inside of them, like the feelings that they're feeling, because they haven't had this like gradient of experience adjusting to what this must feel like. I don't know if I'm being hyperbolic when I say all of that, if I'm projecting something when I assume that, but it really feels like the isolation that the internet allows for is going to make all of these group dynamics in the like meet space IRL way more fraught, way more complicated.
Anyway, we're going to the English countryside.
Let's do it. Hogwarts for thought
Yeah.
leaders. Let's go.
Lily, this was so wonderful. Before we go, can you tell us a little bit more about Groups Group?
Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, we are basically working with all of these questions and thinking really about what is particular about social movement organizations and their group dynamics. Like, how are the ways that we might want to understand those different from like a random organization that a Tavistock consultant might be going into? And yeah, it's still really early days. Like we've been meeting for about a year, but we're starting to do some workshops and, playing around with some experiential activities and toolkits and trying to sort of start to share some of that learning that we're doing. So we have one at the Poetry Project on November 14th for those who are in New York. And I think I don't know, I don't want to spill the beans too much on what we're up to, but watch this space. I think it's something I've been very excited about and just extremely grateful to have a home for this kind of thinking.
Well, thank you so much, Lily. As always, such a pleasure to talk with you and think with you.
Yeah, thank you.
Are you still feeling shame?
No, I feel like I am. I am a little bit worried that my like immediate jump to shame was like an aggressive rebuff of what was a very like high compliment that I actually found very moving. And I continue to like that like worry has been popping up for me throughout the past 2 hours, but in a kind of light way that isn't bothering me too much. But mostly I am in the here and now overwhelmed with delight at how fun it is to talk to the two of you. So thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you so much. This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Dan Yowell and Lily Scherlis. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.